Hello, welcome to this brand new episode of At School With. Today, we're talking about building reuse. What is reuse and what are the issues of reusing? Why a class on this subject? Well, it is an important topic for the 21st century as we are in a climatically challenged time. Therefore, we must think of how we manage and how we use our resources of the world. In essence, reuse is very important to discuss. It is the word that describes how we use an item over and over and over again, as opposed to just once and then discarding. Reuse is exactly that, reusing, reworking, redesignating, and it is how this episode will explain what I consider to be the future of all built environment practices, not least the interior architecture and design of space. That is, reusing buildings, matter and elements. What does reuse mean? Reusing items can mean both anything physical or immaterial, such as an object, like a piece of furniture, a building, and/or the materials embedded in the edifice. It can also mean an idea, such as laws, regulations, or even a style. In short, anything can be reused and put to a new use, time and time again. Sometimes repeatedly and forever. For instance, this dockyard church building in the UK, derelict and without a roof, was the site for my students' reuse project. Kexian Lu, or Luca, turned the old disused building into a new museum of war. I educate students to reuse all existing buildings in new and innovative ways through the understanding that all material is already with us. Essentially, reuse describes activities that are the opposite of single use, a term used to describe your plastic bag used in the supermarket and then thrown away, or drinking straws, many of which end up damaging our natural world, used once and then thrown away. Reuse is the precise opposite of single use. Its provenance is the idea that in this climatically challenged world, we must consider how we manage our current and our future resources, not just the ones we might need to extract, although this should be the last resort, but more so, all of the materials that are with us already. This is of critical importance for us as designers. How do we manage, design with, rework, teach about how we use what is already with us, what has already been extracted and used in a building, what is considered obsolete, and instead of discarding them or it, how it can be brought back to life and not just reused once but for many times. For instance, here is an installation by Alessandro Aravena, a project reusing 90 tons of waste from the previous Biennale to make a new entrance for the latest event in Venice. We have to consider the impact on the world of ours and others' carbon footprints, and the built environment plays a considerable role in this. Construction is known for contributing 40% of the billions of CO2 which are created worldwide. Therefore, the material that is already with us, in buildings, interiors, objects, elements, supply chains and so on, is the new raw material for us to work with and to redesignate meaningfully back into the buildings and spaces that we create. The design of the interior is and always has been about building reuse. In my view, whether a line on a page or on a computer screen of a building yet to be constructed or an existing building awaiting the design of a new use such as a shop, a hotel, a gallery or a home, interior architects and designers always work with existing buildings. The reuse of the existing needs to become the norm for the built environment, and that means building reusers. Yes, you, interior architects and designers, are at the forefront of this challenge. In this episode, I'm going to show how important reuse is. I will show how it can promote circularity when buildings and other elements are reused, how waste can be reincorporated as materials are repurposed, how interiors can decarbon projects when buildings and the materials are sourced locally, and finally how, through reuse, consumption can be rethought and reduced as what might previously have been discarded can now become useful and beautiful again. The work I will show in this episode is beautiful, not just in their aesthetics, but also how they are thoughtfully, sometimes in their own small ways, creating a new sensibility, one that is not prepared to start from scratch and wipe the slate clean, but one that means working with the existing in order to make incredibly exciting spaces and buildings, so it becomes the primary impulse for all designers. I will take 5 basic ideas and ways of reusing and show how the processes and the results not only reduce impacts on resources, but also produce exciting, innovative and unusual spaces that can never be reproduced in a new build project. And the first is salvage. Salvaging describes the approach to reuse in a manner where existing buildings and their interiors can be repurposed through the reclamation of unusual elements and items. These are then reused in innovative and unusual ways inside existing buildings. They are used to create a very particular atmosphere, one which connects the past with the present. For instance, Vitruvius were founded by Maria Speake and Adam Hills when studying architecture in Glasgow. Their approach was formed through salvaging and reclaiming elements of buildings that were often listed for demolition. It is a strategy for reuse which relies on the extraction of the reclaimed material, its storage, and then its deployment within a project, often to spectacular effect. Take for instance their own family home in London, built on top of an existing apartment block. It is designed through the extensive salvage of elements from all kinds of other projects and buildings. For instance, the entrance to the living room was dominated by a series of large terrazzo columns salvaged from a department store in Liverpool in the UK. Furniture, surfaces, textiles were all reclaimed to make this unique family home. Their practice projects include not just homes, but also retail spaces, hotels, all of which are carefully redesigned, utilising elements salvaged or reclaimed from various demolished buildings. This gives each project a unique atmosphere and identity, one which would be impossible to recreate in a new build interior. Salvaging and reclaiming as a process for reuse to make buildings and interiors ensures that each space has a unique identity. It is also an approach that ensures a continuity of narrative. That is, each of the extracted elements placed in a new context ensures that their stories endure, making the interiors and the elements within them timeless. For instance, Collage House in India by S&PS Architects makes a facade that consists of recycled and demolished doors and windows of houses in the city that it is based in. The informal architectural qualities of the collage of fragments creates an addition to the building which is unique. The interior behind the facade is innovative and unusual. Salvaging is a process of reclamation that can also extend to pavilions, or also as new furniture. This is Garden Cabin by Bureau A, completely fabricated out of used doors and windows. Its design and construction is reliant on what is found and to hand, or just readily available and convenient. The elements, such as doors and windows, are salvaged and repurposed for a new use, but they still retain some of their original features and thus stories. Companies like Forma Phantasma reclaim and salvage e-waste. In a project entitled Ore Streams, they made new furniture out of elements of discarded electronic products. Electronics are the world's fastest growing waste stream, but only 30% of the West's e-waste makes its way to appropriate recycling facilities. The remaining 70% is shipped, sometimes illegally, to developing countries, where it is often disassembled in poor working conditions and disposed of inappropriately. Forma Phantasma's research in ore streams examined this trade and how these waste elements were shipped, recycled, dumped and transformed. It explored how they were not just components of consumer goods, but also how they came to represent structures of power, law, regulations, border controls and nation states. The resultant furniture pieces embodied these issues. Like the earliest forms of salvaging, back in history when buildings were pulled apart and resold to make particular antique interiors, salvaging always represents forms of power and systems of law. So to surmise, reclaiming, salvaging, reusing the embodied energies in the existing in order to make new and exciting spaces and objects. This is what salvaging means. When materials cannot be salvaged, they become waste, but even waste can be reused. Reuse relies on wasting. That is, in order for something to be reused, it must be considered as waste at some point or other in its life. In a linear economy, waste is seen as losing its value, is redundant, and then it is discarded. But waste can be quickly turned into a valuable material. This is the House of Contamination, a cultural space made from waste in a large hall in Italy. The room was constructed from waste material and housed numerous forms of cultural activities. Once waste has assumed this designation in a linear economy, it is then taken on a journey where it is discarded, usually through landfill or incineration. This is a direct line of value to rubbish. Instead of this linear route, reuse forms a loop, one where instead of designating the waste directly as rubbish, stuff to be landfilled or discarded, instead it is put back into the systems of use and becomes again of value, a circular economy. How does this relate to interiors? Surely waste cannot be considered a useful material in the making of space. Well, it can. Repopulating buildings and interiors by using waste creates not just unique environments, but it is also a very thorough way of returning waste material back into something of value. Circularity in motion. For instance, take the Maruhiro flagship store by Yuseki Seki in Nagasaki in Japan. Maruhiro is the leading producer of Hosami porcelain. Its ceramics and tableware dates back to the 17th century. Yuseki Seki designed the new store utilising the waste of the ceramic making processes. They did this by making a new raised floor, a plinth constructed from 25,000 pieces of rejected pottery taken from the nearby ceramic factories. This was a process that also reduced the need to transport the material over large distances to the site, lessening its carbon impact. The rejected pottery was stacked and then moulded together with a pour of concrete in order to cement them and make them solid. Timber plinths then neatly separated the finished, beautiful elements from their rejected floor-based counterparts, showing not just the whole process, but how waste can be recirculated back into useful production. Reusing waste, like the byproducts of ceramic making, can reintroduce value into something that is discarded. It doesn't always have to be on show. In the Waste House project, a building made entirely with waste products. Thousands of plastic toothbrushes, DVD cases, offcuts of textiles such as denim went into the walls of the building to make insulation. The unusual and innovative reuse of rubbish or waste can be seen in some clear wall panels. Their heat retention capacities will be measured by sensors placed in the walls. Essentially, it is a living illustration of how waste can be very useful and valuable when redeployed back into circulation and use. The Waste House is a teaching space for the University of Brighton in the UK, and its waste reusing capacities were part of a long-term teaching project. 253 students and apprentices helped in its construction, and many, many more contributed to the collecting of the rubbish needed. It's an instrument of spatial pedagogy. In other words, we learn from it every time we are in it. The mechanics of the building are exposed, so students can learn about heat recovery, construction with unusual materials, and so on. Salvaged materials from a nearby house and a shingle cladding of carpet tiles completed the building. It is one which can truly be described as being rubbish. Other waste byproducts can act as found or ready-made elements, reused to display their unique qualities in such a manner as to still show where they came from. The micro-library by Shao in Indonesia is elevated above an existing platform used by the community for performances, events, and just hanging out. The first step was to encourage this to continue, and so the new building was raised up above the stage in order to form a canopy or shelter for the people below. Secondly, to encourage reading and comfort, and without using air conditioning, expensive for such a small space, a cost-effective method of air and light filtering was needed to make the frame of the building enclosed. Ice cream tubs were sourced in enough numbers and cost-effectively, and were then used as cladding, letting light, air through the interior, yet also shielding the occupants of the library from the immediate environment. The 2,000 ice cream tubs could be read as binary code when opened or closed. And so the mayor of Bandung, Ridwan Kamil, offered a message for the micro-library facade. Buku adalah jendela dunia, meaning books are the windows to the world. So, waste or rubbish is not merely matter to discard or throw away. Instead, it is the raw material for your next project. Think about that as you look to create your new interior. Waste is now a part of your arsenal, your thinking, your strategies, tactics, and the elements for your design. Who would have thought that? Reusing waste materials and also buildings to make interiors can blur or make ambiguous the traditional distinctions between inside and out. When reworking unique buildings such as ruins, issues of value and what is to be retained are foremost in the mind of the designer. This will always lead to the question, how will a building and its new interior be radically altered in their relationship with each other? As an educator, I work with my students to always examine the values surrounding what is to be retained on a site in order to then extract maximum resonances between both the existing and its reuse. This often leads to questions of what is an inside and what is an out. I do this in order to really make students aware of the fundamental ideas of interior architecture and design, but also to raise their understanding of both reuse and waste. For instance, in this old building, Clarendon Park, a Neo-Palladian townhouse was, in 2015, ruined in an unfortunate fire. The destruction left a building that was still partially intact but was extensively damaged. I tasked my students with the question, what should we do with a building like this in the 21st century? Do we restore it back to its former glories? Let it ruin further? Adapt it with new uses? If so, what would these new uses be? And how would they relate, if at all, to not just the existing building, but the world we now live in? These types of questions are always at the heart of reuse work. What is the approach to the existing, and how can it accommodate new forms of use? For instance, Jackie's work examined the ruined house as an extension of the landscape, furthering the relationship and at the same time blurring the boundaries between what was inside the building and what was now out. This is really pronounced when using older or ruined buildings because they quite often have lost their roofs and are open to the elements. We had similar conversations the following year when we reused this ruined church on the Isle of Sheppey, a decayed dockyard building which had fallen into disrepair. The temporary scaffold was literally holding the building up. In both projects, my students explored the ruins as a part of both the landscapes of the town, examining, amongst many things, the relationships between the new and the old and the inside and the outside. Zoe explored the building as an archive of genealogy, inspired by the fact that a colony of scorpions migrating centuries ago from a boat docked in the port had made their new home in the corner of the building. What was once inside was now outside, and vice versa. The new and old interiors were telling not just stories of the building's changes, but also the people whom were a part of the narratives of the local town. Ava anticipated the erosion of the building through climate change, imagining how the building, along with the island, would slip beneath the waves of the North Sea as the climate changed and the sea levels rose, threatening the island's status as a piece of land. When old or ruined are reused, they require a full and explicit reworking, but often it is one that transforms the relationships between the insides and the outsides. Reuse projects such as the Dovecot Artists in Residence Studio by Howarth Tompkins heightens the relationships between inside and out. It does this by infilling the ruined old outline of the Dovecot with a new Corten steel off-site fabricated two-storey studio building. The relationship between the inside and the outside is very pronounced, as well as a complex dialogue. Witherford Watson Mann Architects worked extensively with the Landmark Trust in order to save the battered and ruined walls of Astley Castle. The reuse of the ruins posed very significant issues, primarily around how to approach the site and how to shore up the existing ruin. The 15th and 17th century rooms of the ruin were left as open courtyards, rooms with a big fresco of clouds on their ceiling. The house, designed as a holiday rental, occupied the medieval core of the castle with the bedrooms below. The first floor hall is both grand and intimate, with its warm stone walls and large windows looking out to the ancient landscape. The ruin has been restructured with the new building. Both are reliant on each other and work together in complete harmony. Normally, when we think of reusing elements, environments and buildings that are already in existence, we immediately have to consider what is already available on the site. This raises important questions such as, what might we do with what is already there? Is it of some kind of value to the narrative of the existing place and the new project? And even simpler, how might it even accommodate any type of new use? These questions include processes of preservation, work that has historically been the remit of legislation, charters and laws, which often set out to keep things precisely as they were or are. This doesn't have to be the case. For instance, preservation approaches to the existing can be very unusual and almost radical in how they keep what is there already. This is Croft Lodge Studio by Kate Darby and David Connor. When developing a large house in the countryside, a ruined barn on the edge of the site was designated as a building of importance. Instead of demolishing it, the designers preserved it through encasing it in a new building. They did this with a new steel frame, one which wrapped and supported the old building. Its enclosing halted any further decay of the 300-year-old structure. Not only was the old building stabilised, but all of the various coverings such as ivy, cobwebs and dust, even an old bird's nest was also retained. The black corrugated steel exterior with the crisp white interior not only preserved and arrested any further decay, it provided a powerful contrast to the crumbling, ruined structure. The new building is a studio for the designers and has the capacity to be transformed in the future into a home containing a kitchen, bedrooms and bathrooms, a circular approach to its future life. Relationships between the new and the old can be utilised to effect maximum contrast in a reuse project, especially if the backdrop or host building is very unusual. For instance, this home on the outskirts of Barcelona for the designer Ricardo Bofill was made in a cement works. For a long time, the designer had observed the building, and when it was up for sale, he bought it. Instead of demolishing it, he used the industrial backdrop of silos, smokestacks, machinery, and so on to contain Bofill's new home and studio amongst the relics of the industrial past. It is a truly remarkable home, an unforgettable space which was repurposed to create a dramatic interior. Houses do not always have to be so dramatic in the way they reuse the existing. In Belgium, a traditional suburban house was reused when it was absorbed into a new structure. This created a new envelope which then allowed the interior to be reshaped and opened up to make a large double-height family space. The Utenhof project literally builds a new house around an existing one. The new building increased the floor space of the house whilst also keeping within the local zoning laws. Reusing buildings can make subtle yet meaningful interventions into the way our world is shaped and viewed through our homes. Much like music production, reuse is like a remixer where elements can be sampled, cut and pasted, copied in order to make something new. But they are processes which ensure that the elements remixed don't quite lose the associations of their former selves. Like collaging, remixes in music will often retain some aspects of the original, closely aligning it with a vocal line or a beat, but bolted onto a completely different terrain of sounds. Other times, the source material is plundered for a sound and then recontextualized. This type of work is akin to the reuser. They are the remixer of space and the built environment. As my students will testify, I like them to think of collage as an approach to design which is like the remixer. It is an approach which relieves the anxieties around authorship and originality, and instead gets them to understand that reuse is about working with the existing in a manner which needs them to understand the complex relations with originality, invention, voice, and so on. Remixing and reuse are collage-like approaches to the built environment. Like this remix project, the Sala Beckett by Flores and Prats. In Poblenou in Barcelona, it was built within a remix of the Pau e Justica, a workers' cooperative founded in 1897. The cooperative took over a building in Poblenou which had a grocery, cafe and dance hall with a stage for the weddings, communions and festivities of its members. Bankrupt from the late 1990s, the building fell into disrepair until the designers were commissioned to make the new theatre in 2011. Along with the spaces for performances, the building was reused to house a drama school, cafe bar and exhibition space, as well as the normal services for a theatre such as a ticket office and so on. The designers spent 3 months in the abandoned building cataloguing the remaining elements of the building, making an inventory of the parts. These components, the basis of the work, formed the elements which could be remixed back into the new theatre. Tiles, wainscoting, lamps and ceiling roses were retained and kept. Doors and windows were documented and then safely stored for later. These were all placed back into the interior of the project, making a unique character and space. One which included the retention and subsequent remixing of 44 doors and 35 windows alongside new ones. The resultant remixing of elements back into the interior ensured that the reuse of the existing building became a composite of new and old materials. It is a fabulous, innovative and unique set of spaces, each impossible to reproduce inside a new build project. It is one which we should understand as an exemplary reuse and remixed project. Remixed projects result in a real combination of the old and new, inside and outside, the salvaged, the left to waste, and so on. It is an approach which really prizes the recombination of often disparate materials and one that can bring previously obsolete environments back to life. A row of terraced houses in Liverpool, left derelict for ages and considered a blight on the landscape, were reworked along with the community of Toxteth to bring them back to life and become centerpieces of the community. The buildings, scheduled to be demolished, were reused to become community hubs, selling cakes, vintage clothes, ceramic production, and even a guerrilla garden. Remixing the spaces was not just the physical act of reworking the buildings, but also involved remixing the residents, inserting them back into the centre of the life and activities of the community. So, to bring this episode to an end, I would like to reiterate. Reuse is one aspect of how we, as designers, can rethink our contribution to resisting climate change. The built environment is responsible for approximately 40% of worldwide emissions. We must act upon this huge issue. Through reuse, we can, in whatever way, start to address our own impact on the environment. Remember, everything we work with must be reused. We must overcome the idea of any form of single use, from plastic bags to materials, objects, interiors, buildings and cities. It is our job as designers to purposely think of how everything is always available for its reuse. Thank you and see you soon.